Thank you, Darrell. The feeling is entirely mutual, as you know. It's so wonderful to be back with Sabeel. It always feels like home. It is home. Those of you who have heard the story, and I don't think I'll tell it today, my encounter with Sabeel on that summer in 2006 really was the beginning of the rest of my life, the beginning of my healing, the beginning of my coming together as a whole person. And I quickly got over the sense that it was at least bit ironic or somehow unexpected that it should be an Anglican priest that would do that for me. You know, the story, Darrell told the story about that encounter with my wife, which I've told many times, but there's another one that I like to tell about that in terms of how a Jewish psychologist from Philadelphia comes to be doing this speaking in churches. So it was early on, and I'm in a Catholic church, you know, in the sanctuary, like we are here, and it's kind of a modern church like this one. It's a Catholic church, and I'm giving my talk, and you know, church Christians always want to know, well, where do you worship, right? So there's this woman in the front row, and it's question and answer. She says, well, what's your synagogue? And I wasn't ready for the question. But as is true whenever you're not ready for a question, the answer sort of comes right up on you. And I said, you're sitting in it. Because I actually don't belong to a synagogue now. I said, you're sitting in it. This is my synagogue. This is my work. It's my worship. This is the way I show my devotion to my faith. And and of course, we're in this Catholic church, and there's a crucifix suspended over the altar. Big one. And there he is. So I wasn't finished yet with my answer, and I said, so this is my synagogue, and I'm sure that the visionary rabbi whose image is suspended over my right shoulder would totally endorse that statement. So, welcome to our synagogue. And the people responded the way you just did. There was actually applause. And you know, it wasn't for me. It was because people were recognizing that something important was happening here about us and about me and about him. So, for those of you who've not been paying attention, the peace process is not working. It's not working because it has been founded on at least two assumptions which are totally wrong. I mean, they're actually lies. And I don't know, can I say this in church? They're damn lies. The first one is, and we don't need to go into it, I mean, Sarah has just, of course, brilliantly laid this out for us. One of the lies is that Israel is interested and willing to have a sovereign, contiguous, independent Palestinian state on its borders. It is not. Israel, again, as Sarah has just laid out for us, is doing exactly what a Jewish state, you know, a sovereign state founded on ideology of political Zionism, has to do, which is it has to take control of the entire territory and deal in some way with the inconvenient reality of non-Jews who happen to be there. And we're seeing that is what is happening. And in fact, the occupation, and I don't even like to talk about it as an occupation anymore, and I hope you won't either now that you've listened to Sarah. The occupation is not a bad political decision or a mistake or an aberration or a bad move or a misstep on the part of the Israeli government. It is the inevitable outcome of the whole Zionist project. A project which I, certainly as a Jew brought up on that project, understand, but see as a catastrophic and hopefully someday forgivable mistake. Full stop. The other lie is, of course, that the United States is an honest broker to this process of two parties negotiating, you know, involved in a process of negotiation. Actually, there's another lie embedded inside that lie, which is that there are two parties that can negotiate. The United States, I think it was once pointed out to me, as Israel's banker and Israel's lawyer, and continues to be. I'll have a little bit more to say about that as we reflect on our president's recent trip to the region. So the process that will bring about a resolution to this, and someday there will be some kind of political resolution, how we will get there, what it will be like to get there, what it will look like at the end. I'm with Jonathan on that. I don't think we know. I think if you don't listen to anybody who tells you that they think they can lay it out for you. The pundits don't have anything because they've been going on the old assumptions. Take away those assumptions, nobody knows. That's where we are. So the process that will ultimately bring about a resolution which is sustainable and that works, in other words, which will be based on justice and human rights, will bear a very close resemblance, I believe, to the process that brought about an end to apartheid in South Africa and the end of Jim Crow in this country. And that is a grassroots movement based on nonviolent direct action. And what's the unifying factor between those two? The church has played a huge role in both. Certainly in the case of the civil rights movement, which was started in the black churches, the leaders were pastors. It was a Christian movement based on gospel principles. And in the case of South Africa, we had a chance to go into it in a bit more detail in the workshops. In the case of South Africa, the churches ecumenically, starting with just a small band of outliers in South Africa, and then joined by the entire World Alliance of Reformed Churches, and then the Ecumenical Church worldwide, turned against the apartheid government. Confessionally said, we are not with Jesus as long as we are silent, and in some cases actively complicit with this system of apartheid. No more. It's the end of it. And that was the end of apartheid. So, like Jonathan, I am not here to propose a solution, but I am here to issue the charge. And it's a charge to the churches, in particular to the church in the United States. And the argument is the church has done it before, the church can do it again, the church will do it again. And now that we have a global Kairos movement that is growing, there's no doubt in my mind that we are well on the way. So I was in Holland. I was in Amsterdam. It's almost going on 2 years now, for a conference that was jointly sponsored by Friends of Sabeel Netherlands and Sabeel Netherlands, both of which are supported, interestingly enough, by the Protestant Church of the Netherlands, and that story gets interesting as we go on. And there was a panel. There was a panel about the Kairos Palestine document. In fact, there was a whole delegation of Palestinians, including Naim, who were there. And, Holland's a very flat country, so everything is always very, very fair. And Dutch make sure that all points of view are always represented. So anyway, there was a panel. And the panel was about Kairos Palestine. And on this panel, were 4 or 5 people. I only remember 2 of them because I will never forget them. One was a local rabbi who sort of does the interfaith beat. And the other was the top bureaucrat of the Protestant Church of the Netherlands, which is basically the big sort of almost state mainstream Protestant church in the Netherlands. It's a merger of the old Dutch Reformed Church and the Lutheran Church in the Netherlands. And they, like many church bureaucracies, they have people who cycle through these top bureaucratic positions. This guy was a pastor, and he was there on the panel as well, basically speaking for the church. So I don't remember which one got up first, but I remember the rabbi got up, and he said, "This is a wonderful document. As a Jew and as a rabbi, I fully support the Palestinian people's struggle for justice and for self-determination. But I cannot support this document. I cannot endorse this document. Cannot endorse this document because it tells the Palestinian story, but it leaves out the Jewish narrative. Okay. So I'm sitting there processing this, but in the meantime, the church guy gets up. This is a wonderful document. As a pastor and as representing the church, the Dutch church, we fully support the Palestinians in their struggle for liberation, but I cannot support this document. Church cannot endorse this document, even though our hearts are with the Palestinian people. The reason being that it calls for boycott. That is an action taken against an entire people. We have been down that road before. We will not go there. So I was hardly done trying to process what I would have liked to have said to the rabbi had I been on that panel, when I already had to start thinking about what I was going to say to this pastor who had got my mind going. So the conversation went on in my head for a while. I never got a chance to address these folks, but here's what I would have said first of all to the rabbi, and then I want to get to the pastor. To the rabbi, I would have said, "You're wrong. This document does tell the Jewish story. It tells the Jewish story for today. Yes, we have to honor and mourn for the losses that we've suffered in the past and are suffering, and all of those people who died. But that is our story in the past. Our story in the future, in the present, is the story of the suffering that we are causing to another people. That is the Jewish narrative of today. And someday, we, my people, will be on our knees in contrition for the crimes that we committed. And until that day comes, we're kind of lost. We don't know who we are. We have no idea how to talk about ourselves or to think about ourselves. I'll come back to that later, because I think it's something that you really, if you don't already, it's something you need to understand about where we are, where the Jewish people are right now, writ large, and how far we need to come in order to be able to move forward and to move through this and to move on. The point I want to make is that's our problem. It can't be your problem. If you wait for us to work that out, you will wait too long. To the pastor, what I would say would be, well, I would be very Jewish. I mean, I would answer him with a question. And the question would be, Pastor, do you really not understand the difference between the BDS movement, today's BDS movement, which is a legal, ethical, nonviolent method of trying to bring pressure on a sovereign government that is in violation of international law, and the anti-Jewish laws that were enacted by the Nazi Party in the early years of the Third Reich in Germany? Do you really not understand the difference? I understand your own trauma because you lived through that as a Dutchman, and you were occupied yourself, and you have a lot to answer for in terms of how you treated your Jews, but do you really not understand the difference? So both of these men are completely trapped in their own trauma, and in the case of the church bureaucrat, I think in his own institutional mentality. He had to preserve the church, and he had to preserve the church's relationship institutionally with the Jewish community. That's what's going on for him. In fact, what we learned when we were in Holland was that the Church of Holland, the Church of the Netherlands, has issued a statement talking about the indissoluble bond of the Church of the Netherlands with the Jewish people. And in the case of this church, and I'm saying this because it basically applies to us as well, those institutional concerns trump justice. And of course, we know that that's what we're dealing with, all of us who've been working inside your denominations. understand that that's the dynamic. The charge that I want to issue is that we have to deal with these realities. Now that the Kairos-Palestine document is out, and it is being answered by Kairos documents and movements throughout the world, including our own, we have to move forward, and we are moving forward. But we are dealing with significant opposition and significant resistance. And if you think we've felt that so far, we ain't seen nothing yet. The Kairos-Palestine document is a game changer, and the Bethlehem Call that came 2 years later is stirring things up even more because it calls for the government of Israel to fall. It does. God bless them. They said that. And so what we are seeing now is that Kairos-Palestine and the Palestinian Christians themselves are being attacked, are being called names, are being accused of being anti-Semitic and endorsing violence. If you haven't seen that, it's not hard to find. And that's happening on the part of the churches as well as on the part of the organized Jewish community, the lobby writ large. And we have to deal with that. Because this is a lot bigger than Palestine. This is a lot bigger about a human rights struggle for one particular people. This is about the Gospels. This is about Jesus. That's what's being attacked here. Just like the Holy See attacked liberation theology when it was born, south of the border. Because by definition, liberation theology, which is what Kairos theology is, confronts power. It confronts the institutions, whether they be governments or church institutions, that are responsible for suffering and oppression. And they invoke what they call the preferential option for the poor, and they say, this is what our gospel tells us. And so by definition, somebody in power is always not going to like somebody's liberation theology. And they will fight to the death to preserve the status quo and to put an end to the challenge to that. The other thing about liberation theology, and I suppose you could say this about Kairos as well, why is it called liberation theology? Why is there an adjective attached to the theology? I mean, it is theology. It is the Gospels. What do the Gospels say if they don't say what you do for the least of these, you do for me? What do the Gospels say if they don't talk about the poor, the widow, the orphan, the oppressed, the marginalized, the ones most vulnerable and most in need of the support and of the compassion of their fellow human beings? So it just should be called, Christianity. Let me say a little bit more about that. When I was finally healed by Naim Atik and the people of Seville in Jerusalem in 2006 and realized that, as Darrell said, what I was feeling about wanting to be in East Jerusalem and not in West Jerusalem with my people was what I'd been taught to feel as a Jew, and that this was my Jewishness speaking, and that devoting myself to the struggle was the most Jewish thing that I could do. And I came home, of course. I found that this, by and large, and it's still true, there's not much openness in the synagogues for that message, but that the churches opened their doors. But at the same time, I was educated very quickly by Christians about why there was a problem with this. And they started giving me books to read about how I needed to understand that certainly since the war and since the establishment of the state Israel, the rules had changed, and that the Jews were no longer the damned, but the blessed, and that the original covenant was in place. God loves us best. And that, by the way, there's a real estate clause in that covenant. And I started to learn about supersessionism and replacement theology and how that was the worst thing, that was a terrible thing. And I understand that over the centuries, that was a terrible thing. That the doctrine that the church came up with about how that the church had replaced or superseded the old covenant had been used in terrible ways, and in fact, it doesn't belong in Christianity at all. And it doesn't. But when I finally opened up the New Testament and started to read this hateful, terrible, murderous book that I'd been told I should never open when I was growing up as a Jew, and saw what it was about, and saw who Jesus was, it was very, very clear to me that he was bringing something new. That the church, as he saw it, well, not as he saw it, but as his followers saw it, and as the disciples began to organize, and they literally were organizing something at the grassroots in the midst of the worst evil the world had ever seen. That was the original church, the ecclesia. These were people hanging out in their living rooms and in their basements, afraid they were going to be taken away, and trying to bring the kingdom as they understood it. Jesus was very clear about what that was. I thought, this is something new. Jesus was bringing something new. What's so bad about supersessionism? Jesus was trying to take Judaism where it was supposed to go. And so I'm confronting this, quote, new or revisionist, post-Holocaust theology that says the Jews are the beloved of God, we live in the house of Israel, and the original covenant is in place. And the language of that is Zionism. I thought there's something very, very wrong here. When Jesus comes to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and he stands with his disciples in front of the temple, and he said, destroy this temple and I will build it up in 3 days. Or at another place he says, not one stone will be left upon another. And of course the disciples, they've got smoke coming out of their ears. They have no idea what he's talking about. As usually they're totally clueless, and they say, Master, there's been a remodeling project going on here for 46 years. How are you going to destroy it and build it up again in 3 days? Of course they didn't get it. And then the narrator of the Gospel of John tells us, so that we really get the theology, he was speaking of the temple of his body. Body of Christ, one communion of all humankind united in equality, in compassion. Jesus was looking at the temple, the symbol, not only of the Roman Empire, but of the Jewish establishment that was working for the Roman Empire, and saying, this is over, to be replaced with my kingdom, something completely new. God no longer lives in a house. God does not give land to a particular tribe or a particular family. And in fact, land, once you get to Pentecost, it's made very clear, land is over. You leave Jerusalem. I'm not bringing back the kingdom. No, that's not what the Holy Spirit is about. You are to leave Jerusalem now that I've given you all the languages of the world. I mean, could this be more clear? What it means to speak in tongues? And you will go out of Jerusalem, do not pass go, keep going through Judea and Samaria to the ends of the earth. It couldn't be more clear. That's Christianity. And in this penitential impulse to make up for 2,000 years of throwing the Jews under the bus, that's being thrown away. The baby's being thrown away with the bathwater. And in fact, that was a moment of truth for Christianity. The Christian world, the Christian Western world, stood before the ovens of Auschwitz and said, what have we done? How do we fix this? And what ensued was a very faithful, very painful process of ridding Christianity of the toxic anti-Jewish doctrine that had poisoned it, and reconciling with the Jewish people and building bonds of trust and understanding between the two communities. It's a wonderful thing. It still has to go on. Anti-Semitism isn't over. But you missed the boat completely. What Christians in the Christian world had to confront about their responsibility for the near genocide of the Jews of Europe was Christianity's own exceptionalism and triumphalism. You had to look inside and say, what is it about our own sense of ourselves as special and better with one path to God? Of course, Jesus never said. He said the opposite. But that's not what happened. They said, how can we purify ourselves? We were bad to the Jews. Now we're going to be real good to the Jews. Now we're going to take that exceptionalism. We're going to take that sense of specialness, and God loves us best, and we're going to project it onto the Jewish people. And then we're going to hitch a ride on it. And so now what you have is Christian exceptionalism on steroids. It's Judeo-Christian exceptionalism. Read the literature. Read Paul Van Buren. Read the kind of theology that was produced, and this includes Vatican II, this includes the Roman Catholic stuff as well. It was produced after World War II, and it talks about Jews and Christians, Jews and Christians, Jews and Christians. And Christians are tucking themselves underneath the covenant with the Jews. One covenant, two covenants, parallel covenants, it's the same gymnastics. It's not the point. The point is, there are no chosen. All are chosen. So, it's another opportunity. The Israelis and the Palestinians are giving us another opportunity to confront this evil. And we can't walk away from it. And it's an issue of theology. We have to do the theology. That's the gift of Sabil. That's the gift of Kairos. As the South Africans put it, it is a moment of grace and opportunity where God issues a challenge to decisive action. And the South Africans go on. And by the way, the Palestinians stood on the shoulders of and learned from and worked with the South Africans to construct their document. The South Africans go on and say, this is not a challenge for us as South Africans. This is a challenge for the church. This is a crisis for the church. The church is on the line here. This is a redemptive issue for the church. And it's bigger than Palestine in so many ways. Because what we're seeing is that the Gospels themselves are under attack. I mean, oh gosh, what do I do about the fact that I can never stay with my notes? The Palestinian document is being accused of being anti-Semitic and supersessionist. Why? Because it is unapologetically Christian. The brilliance of what the Palestinians have done is that they have issued a call as a people whose human rights are being abridged. But they're not stating it in terms of human rights and humanitarianism. They're stating it in terms of their faith as Christians. They lay out the occupation. They say, here's what's happening to us. These are the signs of the times, right? Luke 12. And then they say, we must resist this oppression because the occupation is they don't talk about the Nakba, but okay. The occupation is a sin against God. They articulate it in religious terms. And they say, it is our duty to resist because we are Christian, and God tells us we must resist tyranny. And that's where they leave it. Then they talk about loving your enemy. They reach out to the enemy. They reach out to the state of Israel and to the Jewish people, and they say, we will live together with you. They articulate a theology of land. They talk about the mission of the land as being universal. So they deconstruct what Christian Zionism in all of its forms, not to mention Jewish Zionism, but Christian Zionism in all of its forms, including the mainline stuff. It doesn't have to be an end times eschatology. You know, right here in mainline Christianity, we have Christian Zionism. You know, without the dispensations. They deconstruct it. They say it's clear when you read the Bible what the land is for. You go out from the land, and the land becomes spiritual. And yet, Christians and the churches and the seminaries, the academics and the clergy, have thrown that away. There's a guy named John Palikowski. He is probably one of the premier Roman Catholic theologians. He's in Chicago at the Catholic Theological Union. And he's probably the top guy on sort of the interfaith theology circuit. And he wrote a paper a couple of years ago where he talks about the theology of the land, and he says, you know, we've gone too far with the spiritualization of the land. And I'm paraphrasing him here, when Christianity spiritualized the land, we took it away from the Jews. And that was wrong, because it is their gift and it is their legacy from God. And then he goes on and he writes, the Vatican's recognition of the State of Israel in 1993 was the last nail in the coffin of replacement theology. You get what he's saying here? When the Vatican recognized Israel, we finally have washed our hands of the sin of anti-Semitism. We're clean now. So to this Jew who's coming fresh to reading the Gospels and trying to understand what Christianity is and meeting Jesus for the first time, this blows my mind. This is throwing away Christianity. This is denying everything that Jesus came to teach us, and Paul. So this is an opportunity for the church and for Christians to, with both hands, reclaim what is most precious and what is most valuable and what is most important about your faith. And, well, as far as the Jews are concerned, you know, people often ask me, especially after I'm just finished, preaching from the lectionary on a Sunday morning, have you converted? And, my answer to that question has now been, my stock answer is, I'm not quite sure what that means, but, if things had only gone differently in the first century, I would not have had to be answering that question. Wouldn't it be wonderful if all of us, and, I don't know much about Islam, but I have a feeling that maybe many Muslims don't have much distance to travel here either. Because apparently, what is it? Jesus appears more often in the Quran than Muhammad, right? Or is it not exactly? Or maybe it's Mary. But he's there. He's there. It's an opportunity for all of us to come back to what happened in the first century and what that was about. The fateful parting, as it's called, between Jews and the people who went on to become called Christians. It was not about the divinity of Jesus and whether Jesus is the Messiah. It's not what it was about. That whole, all that Christological and theological stuff came later. We know what it was about. It was about whether you're with Rome or whether you're with God. Whether you're going to stay with the deal you've got, which was what the Jewish establishment was about. Herod, the priests in the temple, they're working for Rome. Jonathan would probably not disagree with me if I said that, bears a lot of similarity to the PA today. Who's the PA working for? It was about whether you were with the Torah, which is what Jesus was promoting, or whether you're with the empire that's saying you will not worship God anymore. You will worship the religion of empire. And it will be to make the 1% rich and to impoverish the 99% and to build empire. And of course, that's everything the Torah was not about. Jubilee, right? Nobody gets rich. The prophets, talking about social justice. You take care of people. And you stay with your families and with your communities. And Rome was doing everything it could to break that up. And Jesus appears. And he knew what violent insurrections and violent rebellion brought, crucifixions and villages burned to the ground, and he said, here's how we resist. And now you're right back at Sabeel. I'll never forget what Nora Carmi said to me. She said, how do we resist? How do we survive here in Palestine when things keep getting worse? She said, we follow Jesus. He teaches us that we stay with our tradition, we stay with the enduring values of our tradition, which are grounded in the Old Testament. And that's how we resist. She said, empires come and empires go. We follow Jesus. We're here. So we stand and we sit with the Palestinians in staying here. This is what our struggle is about. If we don't deal with these fundamental issues of faith and belief, if we don't unapologetically, if you're Christian, stand with Jesus and the Gospels, which is the roadmap, then there's no way that the movement can sustain itself. And, we need Jesus more than ever. And this is not me preaching that everybody should be Christian. You know that. It's because if you take a look at Jesus, and you take a look at the context of the first century in which his ministry was carried out, we're right in the 21st century in Palestine, which is like one reason why I'm very fond of saying, let's get people to come and see. Let's use this resource of the tens of thousands of Christians who make devotional pilgrimages to the Holy Land every year. Because what's the phrase that's used? Walk where Jesus walked? If you go there, run where Jesus walked. If you go there and you see what there really is to be seen, you will not only walk where Jesus walked, you will see what Jesus saw. You will see villages destroyed. You will see soldiers and militarism trying to destroy a society. You will see what he saw, and you'll know. Then you can turn to Jesus, and you'll know what to do. So that's why we need Jesus now. And it's devilish what is going on in terms of the attack on Kairos, Palestine. We've seen it with Sabil. We've seen Naim attacked because he uses liberation theology imagery to talk about the Palestinians. And then, in this obscene way, he's accused of bringing back the deicide charge because the suffering man on the cross is a Palestinian and the people who put him there are Jews, so the Jews are killing God again. That's the charge. You've heard it. Well, too bad. Jews are not special. We can be the bad guys, and we are. And you know what? Palestinians are at risk of doing the same thing if they get empowered. It'll be up to them to make sure that that doesn't happen. I dealt with this with the Germans. I've spent some time lecturing in Germany, and I've made a deal with the Germans. I wasn't supposed to talk about boycott in Germany. I was told, don't talk about boycott in Germany. It makes them very uncomfortable. And I got in front of my first audience in Germany, and I started talking about boycott. Because I had just come from this encounter with this Dutch pastor. I said, how many of you don't understand the difference between BDS and the Nazi laws of the the Nuremberg laws? And they looked at me, and it was like, thank you. I said, I'll make a deal with you. You stop seeing yourselves as the worst criminals that ever walked the earth, and I will stop regarding myself as the worst victim that ever walked the earth. We all have to move on. So we have to deal with this interfaith thing, because the interfaith industry, as I've come to call it, is coming to trump justice. There's this penitential project that is becoming more important than prophecy. And I think, as Jonathan alluded to this morning, it's a cross you've got to pick up. You're going to be called the worst name you can be called. It's worse to be called an anti-Semite than to be called a racist in this country if you're a Christian, I think. You can always defend yourself and say, I'm not a racist, right? But hard to defend yourself and stand up and say, I'm not anti-Semitic. A woman in the workshop this morning said to me, what do I do when I'm accused of being anti-Semitic because I'm criticizing Israel? She said, it shocks me that I would have, I said, well, that's good. That's the first thing you say. You are offended and you're shocked. And then you go on and you explain why that's true. So that's how you deal with that, if you're going to deal with that. Okay, I want to make sure that there's a little bit of time for questions. So let me just talk very, very briefly about Kairos, USA. When I went to South Africa, it became clear to me that we needed to go back to the United States and start Kairos, USA, because the South African document is very different than the Palestinian document. The Palestinian Kairos document is the cry of the oppressed. The South African document is the confession of the complicit. And it was a challenge to their own church. And it was very clear to me and to Don and others, when we thought about that, that if there was not going to be an American, a U.S. confession, and a U.S. response to Kairos Palestine, well then, how could anyone else in the world, Christians anywhere else in the world, say, well, we're going to do that? Obviously, we are up to our eyeballs in complicity as Americans, and certainly as Christians. So it needed to happen. Please go to the website, well, pick up a copy of the document. It's really good. It adds one more component to the classic Kairos document, which is that it has a whole section on interfaith. And then it takes on the theological issues of chosenness and of supersessionism. So it begins that work. Go to the website, there is a study guide. It integrates Kairos USA, Kairos Palestine, it integrates steadfast hope. It is the way to get this into your churches and into your local grassroots groups, but certainly to get them into the churches. And then the next project that we are embarking on is grassroots advocacy. Church-based grassroots advocacy in the congressional districts. So imagine this. You're in, First Presbyterian of, Kansas City. And you're next door to, First United Methodist Church. And you're studying this, and you're showing the movies, and you're doing all the education you need to do. And then you get together, and you find out that your representative from your district also is a Presbyterian, or is also a Methodist, or an Episcopalian, or goes to a UCC church. And you get a delegation from several of the churches of the same denomination, and maybe a pastor or two, and you visit this representative. And you talk about what you've learned and your questions about our policy. And you say, and by the way, I'm sure you got this letter, this open letter to Congress from October, signed by 15 leaders from Catholic and Protestant denominations that say, have you seen, how many people are aware of this letter? Great, okay. You bring the letter, and you say, well, I'm sure you've seen this letter. And I'm sure you agree that there are real questions about whether or not we're in violation of our own laws. And we'll see what starts to happen. Is there a tipping point? Are we near that tipping point? Because it's very, very clear that nothing's going to happen without that. I have a good friend, actually it's Josh Rubner, who's one of the main people in the U.S. campaign to end the occupation. He's just written a book about Obama and Israel. I think it's called Shattered Dreams or Shattered Hopes or something like that. And I said, so what do you think about his latest trip? What did it mean? He said, you can sum it up in one word: goodbye. You're on your own. It was brilliant, brilliant politics. Well, and on the way out, of course, he passes them the check. Yeah? Goodbye, you're on your own. Here's the money. Keep doing what you're doing. Well, I think our response to that as Americans also can be summed up in one word. No. We will not accept that. And he's waiting for it. He's waiting for it. And the members of Congress who are tired of being pushed around by AIPAC are waiting for it. They say, talk to us. Talk to us. So I'll leave you with this. The church has done it before. The church can do it again. We are involved in a movement. The people who wrote that letter of the 15 have given us the tool. The people who wrote the Kairos-Palestine document have given us the tool. Kairos USA is a vast resource that can bring all the churches together. Not only mainline Protestant, but evangelical. We're crossing over that wall. It's important. The energy of the evangelicals is critical, and they're on board. And the African American churches as well. It's critical, and they are on board. Jeremiah Wright is now our friend. I can tell you this. I don't have time to tell you the story. But it's happening. And we will be a force, and it can't be stopped. So I'll just leave you with the Gospel of Martin, and hopefully we'll have time for some questions. Wait, I haven't said the Gospel of Martin yet. The judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If the church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, it will forfeit the loyalty of millions, and it will be dismissed as a social club with no relevance for the 20th century. Well, that was 50 years ago, and those words ring out like they were written yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Jim. Do you have time for questions? Probably not.
We'll just,